I'm going to begin with the question that David just ended with, and we're going to do some segues here. My work is on rhetorical theory and epistemology with an emphasis on race, and so I'm new to the whole new media conversation. But the question of why didn't new media or existing media save Troy Davis is one which intersects very much with the work that I do. That work draws upon and connects with the idea of implicit bias, but it looks at it from a rhetorical perspective. And what I'm going to do is I'm first going to talk a little bit about rhetoric and law, and then secondly about rhetoric and race, and then third about race and law, and then finally Rachel is going to talk about race in the media. So let me start first by talking about rhetoric and law. Most people know that the word rhetoric has a bad reputation. That largely comes from the philosopher Plato, who saw rhetoric as making the worst argument better and saw it as not allowing us to achieve justice. But it's actually, as his student Aristotle defined it, the faculty of discovering in the particular case all the available means of persuasion. In that sense, rhetoric basically serves three functions. The first function is as a productive art. So in that sense, we're talking about rhetoric as oratory, as producing speech that is meant to persuade. In the second sense, it's seen as a critical art. And that's a really important aspect of rhetoric that has, over time, been overshadowed by its emphasis on the productive. Most of the time when people use the word rhetoric, they use it in a negative sense. Well, that's just rhetoric, or he's just being rhetorical, or she's just making one argument seem better than the other and being rhetorical. But actually, rhetoric has a very long and distinguished history in Western thought. Rhetoric was part of the trivium, which was logic, grammar, and philosophy, and rhetoric. And it was foundational to a classical education or a liberal arts education. The third sense in which we talk about rhetoric, and this is relatively recent, is to think about it in terms of being epistemic. So the idea of rhetoric is epistemic focuses on the idea how our discourse actually constructs our reality. And that may seem kind of strange, but there are people in all sorts of disciplines who draw upon this, from obviously classical rhetoric to physics. There's a great book by Bruce Gregory called, Language is Reality, or something like that. And he basically says that what we believe is real is what we are told is real. And so in the sense of rhetoric being epistemic, the words that we use construct the realities that we engage. This is very different from the classical rhetorical notion of rhetoric that's given to us by Aristotle. Aristotle saw language as primarily representational. That is, there's a world that's out there, separate and distinct from us, and we talk about it. And in our talking about it, we reflect back on that which is external from us. The idea of rhetoric as epistemic says that the words that we choose construct the realities around us. Now, this is a way of thinking about language which is often seen in relation to very traditional people. African peoples, native peoples use language in this way. And in that sense, one sees a parallel between the way language is seen in Western culture and non-whites are seen in Western culture. And the same types of attributions are made. So my work tries to look at some of those intersections and talks about the way in which rhetoric constructs race, but it also talks about the way in which rhetoric constructs race, and I use this term complicitously. That is, we work together in constructing race through the language that we use. From an epistemological standpoint, the language that we use is framed by an underlying belief in what we call, in rationality, bivalence. It's basically either or thinking. In many ways, the adversarial, oppositional legal structures of English-speaking justice align with that. And so the ideas that emerge out of the Enlightenment that look at law as a way of rationally maintaining and sustaining social contracts is grounded very much in that idea. This relates to the death penalty in the sense that our ideas around criminology and criminalization are very much still grounded in Enlightenment notions. And if you look back at those notions, the ways in which the social contract was played out didn't always apply to everyone. In fact, there were certain groups that were seen as inherently criminal or essentially criminal. And that way of constructing the world, of talking about the world, gets projected out onto the world, but is seen in the narrative or our story as the way that the world really is. So rhetoric provides a lot of insight into law in a very basic sense, because one of the three types of rhetoric is forensic rhetoric, which deals specifically with legal rhetoric. The other is deliberative, and the third is ceremonial or epideictic. So there's connections between the law and rhetoric that go very, very far back, but in many ways, the oppositional or adversarial aspects of both rhetoric and law have powerful implications for how we think about race. So my work on epistemology attempts to tease that out in some ways. So let me talk a little bit about rhetoric and race. Based on the work that I've done, I've tried to think about racism as not just a set of historical practices. Oftentimes today we think of racism as just not liking someone because of their race, but in actuality, historically, racism is a set of institutional and attitudinal practices that emerge in Europe beginning in about the 16th century, which frame the advent of European and the advances of European and Eurocentric civilizations. It's not just not liking people, but it's actually framing the world in terms of a number of different sets of assumptions about what is real and what is not real, what is valuable and what is not valuable, what is human and what is not human. And Europeans, as they began colonizing the rest of the world, saw themselves in terms of two basic principles. They saw themselves first as Europeans, which meant rational, and secondly, in terms of being Christians. Well, rationality and Christianity are premised upon two fundamental concepts. And we tease those out in law and in religion in terms of the notions of fairness. Rationality is based upon what's called the rule of justice. And the rule of justice is the like application of like standards to like subjects, objects, or beings. You treat people the same if they're all people. This helps us understand why, in order to justify exploitation and enslavement of non-whites, Europeans had to define non-whites as non-peoples. The second principle is the golden rule, that you do unto others as you want others to do unto you. Okay? So you take those two principles, which are fundamentally constitutive of European identity, and you place them within the context of a legal discourse that talks about social contracts. But then you look at the reality of how Europeans interact with non-Europeans, and what you see is basically moral incoherence. That is, while the social contract protects all of our rights, what Charles Mills calls the racial contract, and David had mentioned this, it does not really protect all of our rights. And in fact, the rights of non-whites have no bearing, have no legitimacy. This is the actual empirical reality of history for the past 500 or so years. Because of that, because of this moral incoherence, one is placed in a situation where you have to believe the evidence of your senses or you have to believe a narrative and a story. So when I look at race, I think about it in terms of really a fundamental question. Why do people do bad things to other people? If we generalize it. If we look at it in terms of race, how did Europeans justify their treatment of non-Europeans? These are facts. Well, there are three explanations for that. One, it's either a problem of education, which makes it a problem of persuasion. Two, it is a problem of evil. And we see lots of examples of that when we talk about white supremacists, when we talk about Nazis, when we talk about hate crimes. These are conscious and intentional hateful acts perpetrated by people. So it's not that somebody doesn't know what they're doing. And in fact, James Byrd murder basically came out and said, I did it, I'm proud of it, I do it again. Okay? And then the third issue is one that one of my colleagues in argumentation at the University of Utah had advanced back in the 1970s in his work. He did an analysis of the rhetoric of Black Americans, and he asked the question, if we believe that rhetoric is the faculty of discovering in the particular case all the available means of persuasion, and that's the theoretical foundation of rhetorical work, then why is it that African Americans, whose discourse has been profoundly rational, profoundly emotional, profoundly ethical, have not been able to successfully persuade European Americans to treat them as equals? And what he premised was that this may not be a problem of rhetoric, that it might be a problem of the term he uses, psychiatry. Because when you have been constructed and defined as non-human, it's almost impossible for you to make a case for yourself to someone who has an implicit bias and is unaware of that bias. There is, in matters of race, a thin line between rationality and rationalization. And as Mills points out, that is fundamentally the empirical reality of race. So given those three different approaches, those three different ways of thinking about race, the dominant has always been that it is a problem of education. But historically, that is clearly not the case, because some of the most educated people in Western society were deeply and profoundly racist. Hegel, Hume, Kant, Verwoerd, Gobineau, Chamberlain, the list goes on and on. So racism is not simply a problem of ignorance. But most of what we do is premised upon that notion. And so if you are trying to solve a problem,